Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's event. Before I start, I just want to announce that because of the weather, on occasion, there's a power flickage. And if that happens, it may go dark for a few seconds. Just sit still, don't panic, lights will come on. If you find yourself sitting for a long time, you might take note of where the exits are at this time, and those lights don't go out. We've never had a full power outage of any of these events, but you never know. So I'd like to welcome you to the Spring Emeriti Lecture, and this is with Research Professor and Distinguished Professor Emerita of History, UC Santa Cruz, Gail Hershatter. I'm Eli Silver, and I'm president of the Emeriti Association. This lecture happens twice a year. It's a collaboration between the Emeriti Association and the Chancellor's Office. And the function is to highlight the research, teaching, philanthropy that Emeriti do, and looked system-wide, that really equals the equivalent of a 9th UC campus, so it's quite huge. The title of tonight's lecture is Notes from the Life of a Peripatetic Chinese Revolutionary, and there will be time for questions after the talk. I'd like to thank Chancellor Lurie for supporting this series, and this lecture will be recorded, and sometime after this event, it will be made available on the Emeriti YouTube channel. So now I'd like to invite Alan Christie, who's Provost of Cowell College and Professor of History at UC Santa Cruz, and he will introduce Gail.
Good evening, everybody. I'm about to introduce somebody whose CV is 22 pages long, and I'm going to end up leaving stuff out, and I apologize. It'll be important. Stuff that I leave out will be important to many of you. So again, I apologize for that. But anyway, thank you all for coming here tonight in the rain, and thank you for the Emeriti Lecture Committee for organizing this event. It's a privilege to be invited to introduce tonight's Emeriti Faculty Lecture by Dr. Gail Hershatter. I take this opportunity as one more piece of evidence that I am a very lucky man, for I've had the good fortune to spend my entire professional career as a historian with Gail as my close colleague, not just as a member of the history department, but as a member of that smallish tribe on this campus of specialists in Asia. I remember a department meeting some years ago in which we were discussing the department letters for our colleagues who were going up for merit and promotion reviews. I can't remember in this particular meeting what promotion step Gail was up for, surely full professor step 6 or higher. But I remember the silence of the room as we all turned to a discussion of the department's letter for Gail. What could we say? There was so much achievement in so many areas of our profession that, faced with it all presented in the dense prose of a letter to the dean or the CAP or the EVC, I think we were simply dumbstruck. Fortunately, one of our colleagues broke the silence by saying, I think all 3 of these people should get a promotion. The ensuing laughter was both a relief and an assent to the sentiment. And that remains my fundamental sense of my colleague, Gail. She's so extraordinary in so many areas that one can't help but wonder how this is possible. We've asked her that question often, and it still makes no sense. So while the triad of research, teaching, and service are an artificial construct of our review processes, it does give me a way of conveying to you all my own sense of why Gail is a great historian, which is, after all, why we are here tonight. So let me start with some thoughts about being a reader of Gail's work. I'll start by highlighting the titles of her multiple award-winning books, from The Workers of Tianjin, 1900 and 1949, Personal Voices, Chinese Women of the 1980s, Dangerous Pleasures, Prostitution and Modernity in 20th Century Shanghai, Women in China's Long 20th Century, The Gender of Memory, Rural Women in China's Collective Past, and most recently, Women and China's Revolutions. Gail has drawn in these works her focus on the experiences of those who have been marginalized in historiography or subject to the representation of others lacking avenues to represent themselves. This focus on the underrepresented has many lineages from the 60s and 70s, including labor and feminist historiography. But Gail has done so not from a naive belief in the transparency of lived experience, which is a common charge against traditional history. Rather, I think of Gail's work as rigorously working through a fraught relationship between theory and experience that has been at the core of the historical research since the linguistic turn hit historians. I think of a debate between the great feminist historian Joan Scott and the distinguished historian of African America and the Caribbean Thomas Holt about whether or not experience was accessible or itself simply a figment of ideology with all lives mediated by language to the extent that those who are subjected to power may not even be able to use their raw experience to critically envision their subordination and imagine a different future. I also think of Gayatri Spivak's important essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, which poses the question of whether the agentic voices of the subordinated can ever be heard, and answers bluntly that they cannot. Each of these interventions, feminist and post-colonial, have shaken the field of history and its reputation for naive confidence in the transparency of the documentary record. Gail's work, as I read it, works directly in this field of dilemmas. She points us to productive ways of reading a wide variety of sources against the grain, as we say, to get at the traces of the experiences and possible perspectives of the subordinated. I see this especially in her 1999 book, Dangerous Pleasures, in which she seeks not just to write a history of sex trafficking in Shanghai, but access the perspectives of the women who are trafficked. The problem at the outset is that, as she writes, the sources on prostitution are so thoroughly embedded in discourses of pleasure, reform, and regulation that they cannot be used in any straightforward way to reconstruct the lived experiences of these women. The voices of a variety of men are far more audible than the voices of the prostitutes. That's the key to what I think is so remarkable about her work, the recognition of the limits of the work sources that she's working with, and then the way that she goes at those limits to produce really remarkable insights. However, she insists with what I think she called a historian's optimism in response to Spivak, that a subaltern can speak. For example, quote, in the instance of a courtesan who never sets pen to paper, but whose strategizing and working of the system we can infer from the vast cautionary literature that tells her customers how not to be defrauded by her. In the courtesans and streetwalkers who sued in court for release from brothels on the grounds that they had been sold there against their will. These records let us glimpse not only the circumstances that brought these women to prostitution, but also the regulatory regimes of the local government and the ways that prostitutes positioned themselves to get the most they could from the legal system. Without recourse to direct speech, these prostitutes have nevertheless left an audible trace. What she gives us is a picture of agency enacted within multiple constraints that leaves recognizable traces. These traces don't just restore the voices to the record, they make us rethink the record-making itself, a question that every historian, at the least, can benefit from grappling with, no matter what the location of their study. Similarly, in The Gender of Memory, Gail proposes a simple but profound question about the big story of China's 20th century. Did women have a revolution? Or as she put it even more broadly in Women in China's Revolution, quote, if we place women at the center of our account of China's past 2 centuries, how does this change our understanding of what happened? In answering these questions, Gail performs a beautiful version of the historian's dance, moving between a deeply materialist excavation of lived experience and a higher level context that can provide both a broader significance and can itself be subject to important modifications. Put more simply, when reading Gail, I not only know what are the broader issues at stake as she investigates experience, I also see how that experience changes my understanding of the broader context. Reading Gail's work is, for me, a kinetic experience. I can't sit still. Time and again, I read sentences or paragraphs that jolt me with a combination of clarity and profundity. I jump up from my chair and begin pacing around the room, muttering as I think through the implications of what I've just read. I'm reminded of what my friend and mentor Sato Kenji says about what makes a great book. The best books are not those that provide a definitive account. The best books are those that open new questions to be taken elsewhere. And that's how I've always experienced Gail's research. And I think it is worth saying briefly, at least a bit about two other dimensions of Gail's career as a historian, because I think that a key to my understanding of the impact of her research can be found in her teaching and service. I have on a wall at home a photograph from the celebration of Gail Hershatter and Emily Honig, thrown by their graduate students at the time of their retirement. In the front row, Gail seated with her close cohort of China specialist colleagues, Susan Mann, Emily, and Lisa Rofel, as well as Noriko Aso and myself. And behind us stand 20 graduate students, Gail and Emily's advisees, all of whom won tenure-track jobs at good universities, all of whom are making significant marks in the field of Chinese studies in North America and Asia. This is an extraordinary achievement. Coming back to Santa Cruz from up to thousands of miles away in devotion to their mentors, the gathering in the photo is a beautiful portrait of a community cultivated over years. And she's done this, she and Emily have done this together at a place without the resources, and this is no comment on anything other than the history of the campus, that doesn't have the major resources of places like Berkeley and the Ivies and whatnot. So I think it is a remarkable thing. And of course, Gail and Emily, who many of you know passed away last fall, have been a remarkable team of mentors who every student will tell you gave them incredible amounts of time, attention, and feedback. At the same time, Gail has served the broader fields of Asian studies through her presidency of the Association of Asian Studies, through committees beyond my ability to count, reviewing books and manuscripts, writing tenure reviews, and all that comes from being a recognized senior scholar. I remembered also she's the inaugural director of the Institute for Humanities Research and a director of the Center for Cultural Studies, really important positions in the humanities and on campus overall. Time simply does not permit me to list all her work in service to the field, our campus, and our system. But what both of these dimensions say to me is that what you see with Gail's work at this point is someone who not only knows the field, but can claim, if she wants to have been a key builder of the field of gender and sexuality studies in China. And she will tell you truthfully that this was an effort of many: Susan Mann, Rebecca Carl, Christina Gilmartin, Marjorie Wolfe, and many more. But that just reinforces my point. Fields are built not alone, but in ever-growing, well-knit collaborations. Unlike many in the sciences and social sciences, historians appear to work alone with silent time in archives and single-authored books. I have a coffee cup that says, "Historian, I'd like you better if you were dead." To give a sense of what the historian's reputation is, right? But to change the way that many of us look at things, to change or make a field, requires a collective effort of many. And these collectives don't simply come together out of mere shared interest, but out of careful attention by people with the ability to build coalitions like Gail. I think that's what makes her so attentive to the lived experience of the marginalized in her research, and is consistent with her talents in teaching and service to her students and to all of us colleagues. So I'm really excited tonight to see how she does this work that's promised in the blurb of exploring how this one man's life can help us understand some new things about the Chinese Revolution. And so with that, I'd like to welcome Gail up here. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Thank you for that generous, comprehensive, and totally intimidating introduction, Alan. Not sure I can live up to any of that, but I will do my best. Thank you all to the hardy band of souls who came out in the rain, and everybody who's watching on the webinar as well. I'm going to start with a confession. The illustration that I chose for the poster for tonight's lecture may have lured you here under false pretenses. It depicts a mass revolutionary scene in Shanghai, in particular a 1961 rally to denounce US imperialism. It looks exactly the way we think a revolutionary regime would look, and is often how such regimes represent themselves. Full of drama, display, color, collective enthusiasm, and lots of people. When we ask how a revolution worked or how a revolution felt, scholars often concentrate on how government campaigns and politics affected society. But tonight I want to ask this question. What can we learn from the life of a single individual about an event belonging to big history, the Chinese Communist Revolution? My previous work in Chinese history, as you just heard in more detail than I'm going to go into now, drew on recollections of non-elite people who did not leave their own written records, industrial workers, prostitutes, rural women. But along the way, I stumbled on a very different kind of oral narrative, that of an elite Chinese man named Xu Ming, born in 1920, died in 2014. In 1945, Xu was a master's degree student at Clark University in Worcester, Mass., funded by the nationalist government of China that preceded the communists. One of the classmates with whom he became friends, the one with the curls over there, was my mother. When he returned to the newly established People's Republic of China in 1950, he lost touch with her and contacted her again after the passage of almost 4 decades. In the late 1990s, I began to visit Xu Ming in Beijing every year or so on my way to do my real research about rural women in northwest China. As I listened to him chat over lunch, I gradually began to realize that this guy was not just my mother's long-lost friend. For me, as a China historian, Xu Ming's life encapsulated much of the history of the Chinese Revolution, not because he was a major player at the topmost level of the party, he wasn't, but because he was present, like Forrest Gump, at such a variety of historically significant scenes. To begin with, when Xu Ming arrived at Clark, he was already a veteran member of the underground and outlawed Chinese Communist Party. Here's a quick overview of Xu Ming's life, which I'll only have time to explore in small part tonight, and this is also a capsule history of the Chinese Revolution in one paragraph, so hang on tight. Xu Ming was the coddled son of a wealthy family of officials. Like many elite students in China at that time, he was a patriotic student activist during the Japanese invasion of the late 1930s and a war refugee who fled from the coast to China's southwest. There he became a traitor to his class by joining the Chinese Communist Revolution. He was an underground communist organizer in the student movement of wartime China and participated in covert communist operations against the nationalist state during World War II. After he landed repeatedly on nationalist blacklists, his father, himself a nationalist, sent Xu Ming to the United States in part to keep him out of political trouble, unaware that he was already reporting to a top Chinese communist leader back in China. Following his year at Clark University, Xu remained in the United States for the next 4 years, attending classes at NYU, participating in Chinese student activities in the US, writing editorials for a Chinese language newspaper in New York City, and joining a small group that coordinated clandestine Chinese Communist Party work in the US, which I'll say more about shortly. In 1950, when Xu returned to China after the Chinese Communist Party came to power, he served in quick succession as a rural official in Sichuan province, a negotiator for the PRC government at the Korean War armistice talks, a researcher at the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and an attaché at the Chinese Embassy in Sweden. Then he got into political trouble and fell into disgrace in the mid-1950s and was sent to the countryside to labor alongside the peasants, just in time for Mao Zedong's catastrophic attempt to accelerate the transition to communism, the Great Leap Forward movement of 1958 to 1961, and the famine that ensued. In the early 1960s, he was dispatched into long-term internal exile in central China, working variously as a document copyist, gate watcher, librarian, basketball and soccer coach, day laborer, and meal ticket seller, mostly at several middle schools. This meant that when student factions were engaged in armed combat during the Cultural Revolution in the late 1960s, they would call out, "Hold your fire, here comes the basketball coach," whenever he passed by. Politically rehabilitated in 1978, he became a government economic advisor who traveled the world in the 1980s and a distressed and angry eyewitness to the military suppression of the 1989 Tiananmen demonstrations. End of capsule history of the Chinese Revolution. I interviewed Xu regularly from the 1990s until shortly before his death in 2014. Beginning in 2001, he gave me permission to record our conversations and to do as I pleased with the transcripts, quote, after I am dead, unquote. Eventually, it occurred to me that I could tell a story of the Chinese Revolution just by following him around, tracing his travels in the environments he inhabited in each place. Yet, as I worked, I discovered that even though his life and travels illuminated much of the history of the Chinese Revolution that I was spending my life teaching about, his narrative also began to change the way I thought about that revolution. I don't think of this exploration as Xu Ming's biography, but as his trajectory across China, through transnational space, and up and down the class spectrum in socialist China during his years in political exile. So tonight, I first want to explore his trajectory across, with particular attention to his time in the US, and then more briefly his trajectory down, with particular attention to his time in a rural village. And at the end, I'll come back to the question of how this story has helped me think differently about modern China. Across. Xu Ming was a second-generation cosmopolitan. When he was born in 1920, his maternal grandfather was chief of staff to the president of the Republic of China. When Xu Ming was a month old, his mother was invited to bring him to the president's home in the capital's innermost sanctum, where the First Lady presented him with a set of silver utensils. Xu Ming's father had been sent to MIT by the Qing government in 1910 to learn how to build submarines, one of an estimated 650 Chinese students in the US at that time. By the time he finished his studies, the Qing dynasty had fallen, and he returned to China to serve the new republic, working for the government that his son Xu Ming would later try his best to overthrow. Xu Ming remembers idyllic boyhood summers spent in a mansion in a seaside port in East China, where his father became High Commissioner after the British returned the port to China in 1930. Xu Ming was the only son and for a long time the only child in his family, much indulged by his maternal grandparents and his mother, to his father's unending exasperation. As an adolescent, he was well on his way to becoming a bon vivant, a foodie, before there was such a term, a billiard player, and an aspiring ne'er-do-well. He skipped school often, but he was also a voracious reader of the leftist Chinese writer Lu Xun, of progressive magazines, and of a thick biography of Bismarck he cajoled his mother into buying for him that had been translated into Chinese. Then Japan invaded China in 1937. Xu Ming evacuated inland with his father in several stages as the Japanese advanced and the Chinese government retreated. En route, he enrolled in Fudan University, which also evacuated from Shanghai to the interior, and became a patriotic student activist. In 1938, he joined the Chinese Communist Party, reporting to Dong Biwu, who was one of the founders of the party and a senior official. For more than 6 years, Xu Ming worked as an underground party organizer in the nationalist-controlled southwest of China, drawing on his father's official positions for cover and financing. Xu Ming told me that becoming a communist had saved him, that he would have been a wastrel without the revolution. But much about his privileged background and his personality as a young man used to getting what he wanted turned out to be extremely useful in revolutionary work. For some months, he hid a radio transceiver under his bed in his father's home, which was used to keep in touch with the Communist Party's Central Committee in their wartime capital of Yan'an. At that time, Japan had occupied much of the eastern half of China. The nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the communists, led by Mao Zedong, had paused their long-standing conflict and were formally allied against Japan. Nonetheless, the much more powerful nationalists blockaded communist areas and frequently arrested communist operatives in nationalist-controlled areas. To be in or close to the Communist Party while living in nationalist territory was dangerous. So the top circle there is the communist capital of Yan'an. At one point, Xu was living alone in his parents' house in the southwest city of Guilin, that's the bottom circle there, while his parents were in the nationalist wartime capital of Chongqing, the middle circle. The party ordered him to come up with funds to underwrite the evacuation of communist members and party members and intellectuals on the nationalist blacklist. In order to raise the money, since his parents were out of town, he sublet the house without his father's permission and arranged for other underground party members to sell 8 suitcases full of contraband goods belonging to his family: nylon stockings, American coffee, imported cigarettes, milk powder, and pharmaceuticals, including the recently invented penicillin. Xu then traveled to Chongqing and told his father what he had done. By the way, I sublet your house. Omitting the political motivation and saying instead that he had sold the goods to fund a business venture that subsequently failed. His father, suspecting the real reason for the sale, was predictably furious and threw him out of the house, in spite of his mother's heated intervention. But the estrangement lasted only half a year before his father relented. During that period, Xu found a job, and his mother, as always, slipped him money here and there. The party was not in a position to support him or otherwise keep close tabs on his daily activities. This degree of independence from the party center during his underground years continued during his time in the United States. For a long time, his father had wanted to send Xu to study in the U.S., as he himself had done. Initially, Xu was unwilling to go, telling his party mentor, Dong Biwu, that he'd prefer to flee the nationalist-controlled area and head for the communist capital of Yan'an, where the revolution was happening. Dong refused his request. Anyone could go to Yan'an, Dong said, but it was very difficult for the party to get people to the U.S. to figure out what was happening there. He ordered Xu to go to the U.S. and, quote, find a place to settle down, work hard on studying English, and try to understand as much as you can about the actual conditions in the United States. We will decide later what you should do and where, unquote. And so, at the age of 24, Xu left China for the United States and stayed there from 1945 to 1950. He flew over the hump to India on a military plane, booked an officer's cabin, because he only traveled first class, on a U.S. military transport ship, and after a 40-day voyage, disembarked in L.A. He bought new clothes, went out for a fancy meal and a show, took the train cross-country, stopping in Chicago long enough to hear trombonist Tommy Dorsey and his band, and headed for Boston. There he went to Harvard to visit children of his father's friends, but he decided not to stay because, as he put it, there really were too many Chinese students there. All day long they ate Chinese food and spoke Chinese. If you went to Harvard, as soon as you started associating with them, you had your own group, and your group was Chinese people. If I had gone to Harvard, I would not have been able to be in contact with Americans, and it would have been very hard to learn more about the U.S. or to improve my English, unquote. He discovered the catalog for Clark University while browsing in the Harvard Library and became one of 3 Chinese students on the Clark University campus in Worcester at the beginning of 1945, enrolling in courses on history and international relations, which is how he met my mother. For almost a year after his arrival in the U.S., while he was at Clark, Xu had no party contacts, no detailed instructions, and no way to communicate with his party mentors back in China. He was left on his own to work out strategy and activities that might aid the Chinese revolutionary cause as he saw fit. As soon as he arrived in Worcester, Xuming subscribed to the Daily Worker, the official newspaper of the U.S. Communist Party, or CPUSA. Shortly thereafter, the head of the party's Worcester Municipal Committee Propaganda Department came knocking on his door and said, "You've subscribed to my newspaper. Why?" I said, "I have just arrived in America. I really want to understand something about the American situation and the attitude of the CPUSA. I don't know much about the American situation, so I can't really offer any opinions about it. But," I said, "I'm really interested in Marx and the Communist Party." And so he said to me, "Our municipal party secretary would like you to come to his house for tea if you are free on Sunday." Xuming developed a friendship with the party secretary, Ben Silver, a German Jew more than a decade his senior. Silver told Xuming that his grandfather, Silver's grandfather, had joined the First International in Germany. For Xuming, this relationship afforded him a window into communism as a multi-generational lineage. Quote, "They were all workers, and furthermore, they all believed in Marxism. They were almost all members of the CPUSA. He was, his wife was too, and probably his father-in-law and mother-in-law and so forth also were. This was completely different from how one might imagine Americans." About once a month, Xuming went to Silver's house for tea or coffee and conversation, and he attended CPUSA meetings and fundraisers. As required by Chinese Communist Party protocols, Xuming maintained discretion about his own status. Quote, "I didn't tell him I was a party member, but he probably guessed," unquote. On the Clark campus, Xuming did not tell the other two Chinese students of his political sympathies. When one of them, the guy on in the middle there, spoke sympathetically of communism, he avoided the man as a careless talker, learning only later that the man had been trying to recruit him to the communist cause. With his American friends, Xuming did not entirely hide his sympathies. One evening, my mother recalled, she was playing cards with her boyfriend and Xuming. She found herself humming the Internationale, which she had learned in Yiddish as a child in workman's circle after-school programs. She began to sing the words in Yiddish, and her boyfriend joined in, singing in English. And then Xuming joined the chorus in Chinese. But they didn't interrupt their card game to remark on the fact that they all knew the words to the anthem, nor did they discuss it afterward. Decades later, when I asked him if my mother had been aware of his party activities, he shot me a look reserved for hopeless foreigners and said, "It was an underground party." Most of his encounters with other students were with women, whom he found to be more interested and curious about a foreigner than the men. One day he was invited to the living room of a women's dorm. Men were not allowed to be above the ground floor public areas. Some of you may remember this era in college dorm regulation. And he found a group of women waiting for him who began to ask him questions about life in China. Quote, "There was a young woman I talked with for a while, and to my surprise she asked me, 'You people in China, do you kiss?' I teased her. Actually, I was not as honest and straightforward as she was. I said, 'Kiss? What does this word kiss mean?' And so she said, 'Do you want me to teach you?' I said, 'Let's give it a try.' She told me to stand up, and then, unexpectedly, the whole roomful of girl students said, 'No, you can't keep this all to yourself. Let's line up.' Of course, these were very light, simple kisses," unquote. This may not have been what his party mentor Dong Bi-woo had in mind when he instructed Xuming to learn everything he could about the U.S., but Xuming's delight in this turn of events bore no resemblance to the image of ascetic self-sacrifice that was ubiquitous in wartime China's party propaganda. During his year at Clark, Xuming began to familiarize himself with the network of Chinese students studying in the U.S. He had become close to 3 Chinese brothers at Harvard, surnamed Pu. In the summer of 1945, the brothers arranged for him to attend the annual conference of the Chinese Students Christian Association in North America, in Northwood, New Hampshire. That summer, one discussion at the conference was whether China should establish a coalition government that included the communists. The topic was politically sensitive, in part because the Chinese Communist Party had recently advocated the idea and the Nationalist Party opposed it. A heated argument ensued at the conference, which eventually passed a resolution in support of a coalition government. Even as his friendship with the Pu brothers deepened as they were working on this project, Xu never acknowledged his party membership to them, nor did he try to recruit others. He did his party work alone. Xu work as a lone warrior ended when his Chinese Communist Party mentor, Dong Biwu, arrived in New York City after attending the meeting founding the United Nations in San Francisco. From Worcester, Xu read about Dong's arrival in the China Daily News, a leftist Chinese-language newspaper in New York. And so Xu was reunited briefly with his senior party member in New York. Before he returned to China, Dong Biwu put him in touch with 4 other Chinese in New York, all older and with more revolutionary experience than Xu, and instructed them to work together as a group. Xu was assigned to assess the political sympathies of other Chinese students studying in the United States and to work to persuade them to return home and help build a new China when the revolution succeeded. And so, toward the end of 1945, Xu moved from Worcester to New York, where he had several concurrent roles: a PhD student in international relations at NYU, a full-time editor of the Chinese-language newspaper, the China Daily News, and the main person the party had now put in charge of work among Chinese students in the U.S. His activities were now decided in conjunction with this small group that Dong Biwu had created, which called itself the Friday Club because it met on Friday evenings and into the early morning hours of Saturday. The group had 2 interrelated projects: to build support for the Chinese Communist Party in the U.S., within and beyond the Chinese community, and to gather information about the attitude and actions of the U.S. government and society toward the Chinese Communist Party. Xu spent a great deal of time at the offices of the China Daily News. It had been founded in 1940, partly with funding raised by the China Hand Laundry Alliance, a left-leaning association of Chinese laundry shop workers. The China Daily News had close ties to the Chinese Communist Party and the CPUSA. Xu wrote editorials, and he gave oral reports on the situation in China to members of the Chinese Hand Laundry Alliance. Now, they spoke Cantonese. He didn't. He spoke a kind of pidgin Cantonese that he'd picked up along the way, and they said, "Oh, just speak to us in that." And they put up with it because they were interested in what he had to say and assured him they could understand everything he was saying. Xu New York social world was not limited to Chinese leftists. His work as an underground party member and his cover as a young man from a family that had long served the Republic of China government entailed maintaining contact with Chinese from elite backgrounds living in New York. Quote, "Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, I was always hanging out with communists. But on Saturday and Sunday, the people who went out to have a good time with me were all upper-class gentlemen and young ladies of the nationalists. Furthermore, we went to the most expensive places in New York. That crowd included the son of the nationalist military attaché in the U.S. and the younger sister of the general manager of the Bank of China. On Saturdays, we would go to the Copacabana or the Cafe Society, drinking and gambling. Only by having friends in that group could I protect the activities of this group. It was very intense. The thing was, if I was given a task, I had to find a way to cover it up. On Saturday and Sunday, people could see that Xu was hanging around with that group of people. For me, this was just going back to my old habits. It didn't require any effort. When I was in New York, the nationalist special agents became suspicious about me, but afterwards they reached a conclusion. They said, Xu sometimes mixes with the communists, but it is not possible that he is a communist. They really believed that, unquote. Xu also maintained contact in New York with a woman court reporter named Janet, who was a relative of his communist friend Ben Silver from Worcester. She typed his NYU papers for him and corrected his mistakes. On the Saturday nights when he was not clubbing with the sons of the nationalist elite, Suming went with Janet to evening gatherings of her friends. Some were communists who had fought in the Lincoln Battalion in the Spanish Civil War. Janet's fiancé had died in that conflict. Suming learned from these Lincoln Battalion activists about their struggles with Stalinism in the Spanish Civil War. Quote, "Many who survived and returned to the U.S. were said to be rightists by the CPUSA and stripped of their Communist Party membership. They were really outstanding people. They did not care at all about their own fame and fortune. They were idealistic, able to put their lives on the line, wanting to do some good. And the result? They were labeled Trotskyists. Actually, some of them, I think, had not ever really read any Trotsky. The only factor was that when they were in Spain, they were opposed to the political commissars sent by the Soviet Union. That supposedly made them Trotskyists," unquote. From Suming's encounter with the Lincoln Battalion veterans, he learned that Stalin's leadership was problematic, that revolutionaries could be wronged by their comrades and the larger movement, while their own character and integrity remained admirable, and that revolutionary commitment and organizational loyalty were not always aligned. Circulating on the fringes of New York radical circles other than his own, Suming discovered that what counted as revolutionary action in a given situation was contingent and open to interpretation. As he moved across these disparate New York worlds, the Communist Friday Club, the Chinese newspaper, laundrymen, NYU students, pampered nationalist youth, Lincoln Battalion veterans, Suming kept to himself in some important respects. His older colleagues in the Friday Club had families, but his circumstances made it impossible for him to form deep attachments, even if he had been inclined to do so. Quote, "At the time, I had a very big problem about dating. I could be called back to China at any time, and I would have to go. If I had a relationship that went too deep, it would be a problem. The important thing I discovered as an underground party member was that if I married, and especially if I had children, I would have no way to do this work. So at that time, underground party members, including people in positions of real responsibility, were all very young. Because all of those who were a bit older with a big pile of wives and children, how were you supposed to make revolution? You couldn't let your children have nothing to eat. I was very aware of this. I didn't lack for girlfriends in the slightest, but why would I get married? For example, Janet was on good terms with me, and we saw each other often and got along very well, but I knew that if I had to go back to China, it would be a lot of trouble. There were some young women from China, but I also didn't dare to get too close to them," unquote. After 1947, Suming stopped working at the newspaper and devoted more of his time to collecting information about the U.S. for Chinese Communist Party leaders working in Hong Kong, who would then relay it to the leadership in China. There was, at that moment, a civil war going on between the nationalists and the communists, so the communists were moving around a lot. This was mainly a matter of running, for Suming, a one-person clipping service. Quote, "I subscribed to 3 or 4 newspapers, the New York Times, the Herald Tribune. I subscribed to the relatively important magazines of that time. The Nation and the New Republic had more influence at that time than they do now. I also subscribed to 5 or 6 other magazines. As for the articles I clipped, one kind were those that analyzed serious problems inside the United States and the attitude of the United States toward major international problems. But by far the most important were those concerned with China-U.S. relations. This also increased my own understanding of U.S. politics. After I logged them, I would mail them, probably every 2 days." Not all of the information he collected came from the U.S. press. In the nationalist Chinese embassy in Washington, for instance, he depended on another underground party member to copy all of the documents about American military aid to the nationalists. The guy in the embassy would send them to Suming, who sent them back to Hong Kong via left-leaning Chinese sailors, among whom were party members and sympathizers. Hong Kong would then telegraph the information to the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, which was now in open civil war. By summer 1948, the Friday Club had dissolved. 3 of its members went back to China. After that, Xuming was almost as much on his own as he had been in Worcester. Quote, "In the U.S., we read the public material and tried to figure out what we should be doing. We didn't have collective discussions at that time. Mainly, I felt if something should be done in a particular way, that was how I did it. There was no more Friday Club. With many questions, there was no concrete direction about how they should be handled." Like the other members of the Friday Club, Xuming, his strongest desire was to get back to China. Adept as he was at life in multiple New York social worlds, he had no desire to remain on the periphery of the Chinese Revolution. Finally, in the summer of 1949, he found a way home. By that time, much of China was under communist control. But almost as soon as he got back to China, he was sent back to the U.S. by Zhou Enlai, who was soon to become the People's Republic of China first foreign minister and then its premier. Zhou told him, quote, "After you go back to the U.S., your main duty will be to mobilize the intellectuals in the U.S. to come back and construct the motherland." That is, Chinese intellectuals studying in the U.S., especially those who have studied natural science and technical skills. Mobilize them to come back. Xuming returned to the U.S. willingly, if not happily, just weeks before the People's Republic of China was formally established on October 1st, 1949. Already aware that the relationship between the U.S. and the Chinese Communist government was likely to become strained, potentially attracting unwanted attention to his recent trip back to China, he made sure to return in time for the fall semester at NYU, in keeping with his identity as a PhD student. Arriving back in the U.S., he delegated the mobilization of Chinese students to people in 2 organizations where he already had contacts: the Chinese Students Christian Association, where he'd been active since his year at Clark, although he wasn't a Christian, and the Association of Chinese Scientific Workers in the United States, which he had helped to found. Then he made himself as inconspicuous as possible. Quote, "I would go to classes at NYU in the evening, not too many. I had nothing to do during the day. I was not visibly active in order to avoid attracting attention. I went to live in Great Neck. Every day I helped 2 friends who had just had a baby. I would go there for lunch and help them grow vegetables." Unquote. Interviewed many decades later, the friend's younger sister recalled, "Xuming was fat and liked to eat. He often came to my elder brother's house for Chinese food. We all called him Fatty Xu." Unquote. In retrospect, Xuming regarded this work, persuading young, educated Chinese in the U.S. to return home, as one of his major life's accomplishments. Quote, "The construction of China after liberation is closely related to the return from the U.S. to China of a cohort of students and intellectuals, with achievements including the atomic bomb, scientific achievements, and research in every field. Almost all of the early members of the Chinese Academy of Sciences were in this cohort. The best Chinese students studying in the U.S., most of them went back to China. Some of them suffered misfortunes. That's a separate problem, but some of them made major contributions. I think this was my most successful achievement. I did not do anything whatsoever to hurt Americans, but I really and truly made a definite contribution to the development of China after liberation." Unquote. The U.S. government apparently shared Zhou Enlai's assessment that Chinese students in the U.S. were a valuable asset. As the Cold War heated up, on October 9, 1951, the Bureau of Immigration and Naturalization of the U.S. Department of Justice issued a decree for prohibiting Chinese students of science, engineering, medicine, and agriculture from returning to China. Prior to that announcement, however, Xuming's work had already borne fruit. In August 1950, more than 100 Chinese students returned to China on the ship President Wilson. In all, between Xuming's return from China to New York in fall 1949 and the promulgation of the 1951 ban, about 1,000 students returned to China. In December 1949, only a few months after he had returned to the U.S., Xuming received a message that he was to return to China immediately. Upon arriving in Beijing, he began work at the newly established Foreign Ministry of the People's Republic of China. So that's his trajectory across. Now about his trajectory down. In 1951, Xuming asked the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to send him on temporary assignment to the countryside. He was aware that as a privileged son of urban China, he had little idea how Chinese peasants lived. It was high time, he felt, to learn more about them. At the time, the party was finishing up a multi-year land reform initiative aimed at expropriating land from exploitative landlords and redistributing it to poor peasants. After investigation, everyone was to be assigned a class label: landlord, rich peasant, middle peasant, poor peasant, hired laborer. In addition to redistributing land, the campaign was intended to build peasant activism and attachment to the Communist Party through political struggle meetings directed at local evil tyrants. Xuming was assigned to a land reform work team. He spent half a year in Sichuan province, and for 4 of those months, because of a severe staff shortage in the countryside, he ended up being made temporary Communist Party secretary of a rural district, effectively the senior official in that district. In short order, Xuming learned the following. First, in spite of official exhortations to learn from the peasants and share their hardships, county officials told him privately, if you're going down to the village, bring your own food, because peasant food is too awful to eat. So he learned that there was a difference between propaganda and actual official attitudes. Second, peasant political consciousness was not as advertised in party propaganda. The hired village laborer with whom he bunked in the village was not the least bit interested in land reform politics. He was more worried about the fact that he couldn't find anybody to marry him. And he did not connect that to his lack of land ownership. Third, every day, Xuming's rural district received 8 to 10 directives from above, far too many for the limited staff to implement. Instead, they resorted to writing false reports that said they had completed whatever task was being assigned. Fourth, many of the directives were so inflexible that they made no sense to the locals, as when every village was instructed to dig several wells, even in villages like his, where rain was plentiful and the villagers already had a sophisticated water management system. Xuming also observed that very few, if any, genuine landlords remained in his county. They had all decamped or been locked up or killed in earlier campaigns. Those who were left were themselves poor people who perhaps rented out a bit of their land to their neighbors. But the directives from above mandated that each district had to label at least one person a landlord, and any local official who could not find one could be accused of having counter-revolutionary sympathies. In spite of the paucity of actually existing landlords, or perhaps because of it, poor and hired peasants had every incentive to place their neighbors in a class that was wealthier than their actual one, a dynamic that was not unique to this district. Quote, the more people who were labeled landlords and rich peasants, the more land you could distribute to people who had little or no land. They tried as far as possible to push the middle peasants upward. So middle peasants were labeled rich peasants and rich peasants were labeled landlords, unquote. Xuming quickly discovered that villagers in his district were incorrectly upclassifying many households as rich peasants in violation of party policy. The party had very strict directives on how to do this, but they also had a quota system. Not one of the several dozen people who were being proposed as rich peasants in his district met the party's own criteria, but he could not report this to his superiors. Quote, if I reported to the county that in my district there was not a single rich peasant, it probably would have been very easy to have me removed from office or even taken into custody and remanded to Beijing for trial. I would have been seen as someone with extreme right-leaning tendencies, going so far to say that in a district with tens of thousands of people, there was not a single rich person? I thought, suppose I persist and say there are truly none, and I am removed from office and replaced by someone else. And the reason I was sacked was because I had right-leaning tendencies. The next person would certainly be extremely left-leaning, and I feared that he would take all of the reports from the townships and designate many more people as rich peasants. So, in each township, I designated one person a rich peasant. I approved that classification for whoever was most like a rich peasant. All the rest of them I did not approve. The grassroots had no response to what I did, and neither did the upper levels. As long as they could report that they had completed their mission, then it was fine, unquote. Years before false reporting from the grassroots helped lead to a catastrophic famine during the Great Leap Forward, Xu Ming saw and participated in the dynamics that made false reporting necessary. To Xu Ming, the problem was that people at several levels removed from the grassroots could not shift their thinking to take account of local particularities. Quote, when the State Planning Commission discusses some national matter, in their minds they just can't imagine how complicated the situation is below them. Actually, even a single village is very complicated. If you make a rule and expect all of the villages in China to implement it, there's basically no way to do so. So don't have superstitious faith in the Communist Party, thinking that they can carry out something all at once. That situation doesn't exist, unquote. When he left Sichuan in spring 1952, after serving for 4 months as district party secretary, Xu Ming still felt that land reform was a correct and necessary thing to do. Good for giving farmers their own land, good for raising women's status and developing women cadres, good for mobilizing farmers. He maintained that conviction his entire life. But his sojourn in the countryside left him with a disquieting sense of the disconnect between revolutionary ideals and actual practice. Quote, I have seen this society from the top looking down and from the bottom looking up. These two are very different. The Chinese Revolution actually was the confluence of several distinct kinds of power. The party structure, when I think about it, is based on the rural base areas engaged in armed struggle. Its foundation was peasant society. Then, within the party were urban intellectuals. That portion had accepted Marxism. These were the two branches. If they had not joined forces, they would not have survived and ultimately gained political power. But when they were together, there was a big disparity. It was not the case that only those who had truly been oppressed could take political power and be in charge. In the end, the fruits of revolution were all taken by a few people who were able to play with power, unquote. In the 1950s, Xu Ming married, then served as a Korean War negotiator and as a diplomat in Sweden, adventures I don't have time to recount to you today. But in 1957, on a brief visit home from Stockholm to visit his dying father, he wandered unawares into an unfolding political disaster that quickly became personal. Visiting his home work unit, the Foreign Ministry, he discovered that one of the Pu brothers, whom he had known since his first year in the U.S., was coming under political criticism. It was the beginning of a campaign known as the anti-rightist campaign, when many party members and intellectuals were criticized, removed from positions of responsibility, demoted, and sometimes sent into internal exile. Xu Ming and another one of the Pu brothers took the distraught man under criticism out to dinner to try to convince him not to lose his temper if he was accused in a meeting. The three of them finished a bottle of Mao Tai together. As Xu Ming escorted his inebriated friend home, Pu paused in the foreign ministry courtyard under the bank of windows where all the leadership lived and repeatedly yelled, "They are going to make a political target of me." Because Xuming was with him and subsequently refused to denounce him as anti-socialist, and perhaps also because Xuming's own long stay in the U.S. had rendered him suspect, he too was labeled a rightist. Ultimately, somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million people in China during this period suffered the same fate. These events truncated Xuming's career in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and forced him to return from Sweden. To protect his wife from sharing his punishment and to protect his young daughter's welfare, he eventually ended his marriage and severed contact with his daughter. He was not permitted to reside in Beijing for more than 20 years, until the late 1970s, when his record was cleared. His years of internal exile afforded him a view of the Great Leap Forward from the North China countryside and of the Cultural Revolution from a city in central China. He had ample opportunity to observe from the periphery how central decisions made in the name of revolution produced uneven consequences. He viewed the unspooling of high Chinese politics with a certain degree of equanimity and interest, even when the chaos periodically reached down into his work unit to ensnare him. His memories of those years, shaped by political disgrace and heartbreak, are nonetheless as full of curiosity and humor as his account of his New York years. But that's a story for another time. I said at the beginning of this talk that I was interested in writing about Xuming's trajectory rather than his biography, and that listening to Xuming made me see the Chinese Revolution differently. Let me just suggest a few ways in which this trajectory approach has been fruitful for me in rethinking the revolution. First, about his trajectory across. We have thousands of personal memoirs and biographies of Chinese revolutionaries, but few of them center on the transnational character of that revolution. We're far more likely to focus on the story of Mao Zedong and his men, and a few of their wives, and how they developed their unconventional approach to organizing in China's remote rural areas in the 1930s and 1940s. But Xuming moved in the periphery of what we usually think of as the key events of the Chinese Revolution. He never made it to Yan'an, the Chinese wartime capital, and so he was not part of the rural-centered story we tell about the revolutionary movement, nor of the militarized environment that produced its most prominent leaders and some of its most notable problems. His underground work in southwest China was mainly solitary, and it depended on his status as the cosmopolitan son of an elite nationalist family. This was his cover, but it was also an important component of his subjectivity. It shaped his sense of what constituted revolutionary activity, what was possible, and how a revolutionary might move through the world. And move through the world he did. He was one of many Chinese from varied backgrounds who traversed the globe in search of work, education, commercial opportunities, and political alliances. A rich Shanghai kid who grew up on Hollywood movies, a lover of Tommy Dorsey big band music and Charlie Chaplin, as well as Marx, and the Chinese writer Lu Xun. Xuming was effortlessly transnational in his tastes and curiosity, as well as passionately committed to communism. However, here the term transnational itself has to be used carefully. Most of Xuming's time in the U.S. was spent in political organizing in various sectors of the Chinese diaspora: students, sailors, journalists, laundrymen, etc. Following his trajectory through New York and other places, it's always necessary to ask what and whom he knew and cared about in the many places he lived. Moving through the different Chinese worlds of New York, and a few leftist American worlds as well, let Xuming see the complexity of the revolutionary assemblage and take account of the factors that had shaped its different elements. The consciousness formed by his trajectory also shaped his perceptions once he returned to China. Seen through the life and times of Xuming, the Chinese Revolution does not appear as a tightly directed top-down affair, nor does it appear as a collection of distinct local activities. It looks like a web of partially linked projects, animated by a common vision, but requiring improvisation, flexibility, and guile. To understand that revolutionary movement, we need to pay adequate attention to this variability and contingency, especially when encounters crossed national lines. Thinking about the communists and other radicals Xuming encountered in his New York years as comprising a web highlights the cross-fertilization of ideas and understandings afforded by his sojourn in New York. His angle of vision as a revolutionary on the periphery continued in important respects after he returned to China. Second, about Xuming's trajectory down into non-elite Chinese society. Tonight I've only had time to give you one instance of this during the land reform campaign. There are many more dating from his long period of internal exile after 1957. Beginning in 1949, there was a unifying state authority trying to impose a uniformity of purpose on a disparate population. It was not like Xuming's situation in New York, where making his own decisions and sometimes making things up was part of his work. But the government's desire in China to unify power was stymied by the varied cast of players and local circumstances and local interests. The central authorities had one idea about land reform involving uniform categories and criteria and classificatory schemes. The hired peasant had another. He wanted a wife. The poor peasants seeking land from non-existent landlords had a third. And overstretched local officials such as Xuming, caught in the middle and needing to report success upward, had a fourth. Faced with this multiplicity of agendas, improvisation was necessary. And in Xuming's opinion, so was harm reduction. He did not think that this connect between the rulers and the ruled was a new product of the Chinese Communist Party's rule. He suspected that peasants had become adept at dodging and adapting to directives from at least as far back as the first emperor of China in 221 BCE. As a temporary local official, he too became skilled at dodging and adapting. Xuming was never a top-ranking Communist Party member, although in the 50s he held various responsible posts for the Chinese Foreign Ministry in Beijing, Korea, and Sweden. So he wasn't a top guy, but nor was he an ordinary member of the masses, as the Chinese Communist Party might put it. Much of our scholarship on this period in China has concentrated on two questions. What were the struggles inside the party? And how did the party mobilize or alienate the masses? Xuming was somewhere in the middle. He had a boundless curiosity about international politics. His commitment to the revolutionary project was unwavering, but his sense of how to proceed was attentive to nuance and ambiguity. He and other cosmopolitan communists like him were held in some suspicion by homegrown revolutionaries. The party leadership wanted their knowledge and expertise, but was skeptical of their judgment and their loyalties. Xuming's trajectory makes me wonder about the middling layer of revolutionaries and how they understood their life's work and the improvisation it required. Many memoirs of the revolution published after the Mao years trace another kind of trajectory, from idealistic commitment to disillusionment. Xuming's story is not one of those. His goals for China, which he held until the end of his life, were practical, shaped by the moment in which he came of age. He wanted for China survival, sovereignty, economic development, and a move away from massive inequities. He understood himself as a patriot, an anti-imperialist, and a communist, but it is not clear that he would have called himself a nationalist. He didn't speak in terms of China's destiny, or China's rise, or China's rightful place among other nations. Nor was he a vocal advocate for a uniform world communism. He was keenly attuned to political divisions within the US and across Europe, and it was those differences and the specifics of each place that held his fascination. His trajectory has pushed me to think harder about what makes a revolution compelling to those who remain committed to its goals, even when it derails their own lives. For me, his story is good to think with. I hope that's true for you as well. Thank you. I'll give you the mic.
Thank you, Gail. There will be time for questions, and before you ask a question, be sure you have a microphone to talk to. Those of us in here would hear you fine, but those on Zoom, who are probably more numerous than those of us here, won't be able to hear without the microphone. So there should be people running around with microphones, and are there any questions? There we go. Barry.
Well, you were sort of answering my question at the end, but I was wondering, how did he articulate why he decided to become a communist at such an early age? Was it a moral decision, a pragmatic view of the future, especially given his background?
Yeah. The traitor to his class question is a really serious question, but in that way, he was typical of a lot of elite kids at that time. There was a big critique floating around in China, articulated often by university professors and university students, of what they called the feudal society, the evils of the feudal society, and the inequities and the poverty, especially among the rural population. And there was a lot of expose and muckraking literature at that time. And that was conjoined with a really keen sense that China was being cheated and bullied in the world because of its own weakness, and students and professors, actually, some of the chief troublemakers, linked those two together and said, if we could address the inequities in our society, we could make ourselves into a stronger nation. And they often articulated this actually, not just in terms of class, but gender. If we would stop binding our women's feet and making them stay home and letting them stay uneducated, we would be a much stronger place and able to stand up and take our rightful place in the world. So that's the kind of thing that started to pull him in. But I also think that, and he said, that the Japanese invasion of China and the way that it just turned China upside down, you know, everybody, most of the elite evacuated the East Coast and went to the interior, taking the universities and some of the factories with them, you know, strapping stuff on their backs. And there was a lot of interest in what kind of state formation, government formation, would enable China to stand up and push this back. And it was in that environment, as I think an 18-year-old, that he joined the Chinese Communist Party, which immediately put him to work first organizing among other university students, and then realizing that his father was a high official and he could get away with all kinds of stuff, said, why don't you put the transceiver under your bed? Why don't you, find funding around your house to fund this or that? So that part is particular to him, but the initial draw was quite typical of many elite students of his generation.
Shelley.
No, you got to wait for the mic, Shelley. Thanks.
Thank you. That was completely riveting.
Thank you.
Now the question. What kind of written record did Shuming leave from his long, he was in so many circumstances in which finding his notes by the wrong people would put him into danger and other people. And also when he was banished and so forth. And you have this very complete thing. Is this his memory, or did he take notes, and what did he do with them? How did he deal with them?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I spent most of my life as a historian, as Alan said, chasing around people who didn't leave notes. And then I find this elite guy And every time he mentions the name of a person, you can look that person up in 27 different who's who in China. But he himself wrote very little down. He was an underground party member, as he reminded me. They were not supposed to leave notes around. They communicated with each other in extremely cryptic ways, and mostly orally when they could. And then later, in the 90s, when there was this big spate of memoir writing, he wrote 2 or 3, 4-page things illuminating a particular incident. Someone would be doing a big retrospective on some communist hero that he'd had contact with, and he would write his story of that person. So I have all of this stuff about his father, who was a nationalist official and left a gargantuan bureaucratic paper trail, but very little about him. From him, luckily, I started interviewing him, in maybe 1996 and kept interviewing him. He died in 2014. I last did a long interview with him in 2012. And so we would go back over and over lots of different stories. And he gave me a lot of concrete, his stories are very concrete. And every time I would go do more conventional historical research, did this really happen when he thought it happened? It checked out. So I've assembled a lot of background stuff, but in terms of the trajectory of him through the world, I am very reliant on this oral narrative, and it just highlights, I've spent a lot of time thinking about how non-elite people die and they don't leave a record. Sometimes elite people die and they don't leave much of a record either. There were many people like Xu Ming whose stories we're never going to hear about because it was their business not to write them down and leave any record.
Thank you, Gail. How totally amazing. And like she said, riveting every moment. Well, I have a question I'm sure you've thought about as someone who spent your life studying women's history. How is this a man's story or a male-specific story? How would it have been different if he had been born a girl?
Yeah, well, that would have been super interesting. And he did, very late in the game, kind of by accident, tell me the story of his first girlfriend before he came to the U.S., who was an underground communist operative. How did I find out about this? Not because he ever exactly volunteered it. He was telling me that story about kissing people on the first floor of the dorm at Clark, and I said to him, "What did you know about kissing?" And he said, "Turn off the mic. I'm going to tell you something I haven't even told my daughter." And he spins out this whole story about this woman who he had a bit of a romance with, and then he left, and she went to Yan'an, and he went to the U.S., and by the time he came back, they were both working for the foreign ministry, and she was married to someone else and had a kid, and they didn't talk until, I think, 2011 about what had happened. Much too long a story to go into here, but it gave me a little glimpse into, there were women in this position, and in fact, a lot of women who ran away to join the revolution at that point were running away to get away from either arranged marriages or déclassé families where someone had gambled away the family stuff, and so there was some chance the young woman was going to get sold. And so often what pushed them out of the house and into running away to the communist base areas was gendered in a way that it wasn't for boys. But in another sense, and this is something I have not sorted out, I don't know, there are women in this story. There is his mother, there's the one I just told you about, there is his first wife whom he divorced against his will, there's a second wife he married in about his 18th year in exile, unaware that he was going to be exonerated and allowed to go back to Beijing, a year later. And every time I try to put their lives into the story, it gums up the narrative because their lives work on a different kind of temporality. And you can't tell the story exactly the way you can where you follow him around like Forrest Gump. His mother was educated at a English-speaking missionary college in Beijing, and then she married into another elite family. She never worked outside the home. She spoke English probably better than Xu Ming did, but she never left China. She adjusted to the fact that her husband took a concubine. In fact, I think she encouraged him to take a concubine for various reasons. And, the temporality of that story is a different kind of temporality from, and then Japan did this, and then China did this, and then, and how to tell both those stories at once and let them interrupt each other is kind of a narrative nightmare for the historian. But I probably intend to foreground it and not bury it when I write this.
Oh, thanks, Gail. I'll repeat what everybody said. It was really, just really, every detail was somehow illuminating and beautifully told. You just told us something that he told you not to tell, or that he didn't want recorded. And that made me wonder whether, unlike an archive, your archive is a human being with whom you have
Right.
personal relationship, loyalties, friendship,
Right.
affection, a lot of things. And, if it's written down, there are no constraints about what you can reveal or say. But with another person, there always are to some degree. So I can't really ask you to tell us if there are things that you left out or suppressed, if we could put it that way. I can't ask you to tell us what they are. But I would be interested to know, have you reflect on that issue, if it was an issue, and also, I guess, too, the way in which, if you can, the way in which your relationship with him and your understand have shaped the way you're telling the story. I mean, you're the historian telling the story, but you're also telling his story.
Yeah.
The way, at some level, the way he wants it told. And I'm wondering how you are thinking about that as you finish it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting, complicated question. On the specific, turn off the tape recorder story, he then proceeded to tell me this long story. His daughter then came in. I was interviewing him in his daughter's office in Beijing. And he said to her, "Sit down, I have to tell you something." And proceeded to go through the whole story again. He said, "I had a girlfriend before I married your mother. I hope you don't find this upsetting." And she looked at him. She said, "You're in your 90s. I'm going to get upset about this now?" And he went through the whole thing, and he then let me record it, in fact. But there weren't so many things he told me that I feel like I can't say. But there are things that I don't know how to handle. One is he had a younger sister who was 16 years younger and who was an aspiring TV script writer. Actually, she was a writer for TV, but she was an aspiring novelist who wrote this first volume of what was going to be a multi-volume historical novel about her family. And then she died pretty early after the first volume was published. And the first volume was all about sexual scandals between the parents. And he was dead by then, and she was dead by the time I saw this. And I said to his daughter, "What? Did this happen?" And she said, "Oh, my dad didn't tell you about any of this?" Yeah, everybody in the family knew all of this. And the daughter who wrote it down heard it from the mother. And yeah, as far as we know, it's all true. So this is family lore told in a fictional format, possibly with an eye toward a made-for-TV historical series. What am I supposed to do with this? So that is one of the things I'm wrestling with. And of course, because he was in exile, I know things that happened to his family, some things that he didn't know that happened to his family after he left, that they told me after he died, that I won't write about and that I won't talk about, but that just heighten my sense of what the human cost was of when certain kinds of revolutionary practices go off the rails. I feel like I got to do a huge shortcut because he just figured, well, your mother was my friend, so now you're my second daughter. And all of the distance that usually happens between historians and their subjects, interviewers and interviewees, Chinese and foreigners, men and women, got as minimized as they could possibly be under those circumstances. I feel like with that comes a responsibility. He was really clear, do whatever you want with this, just wait till I'm dead. And he saw all the transcripts of all the interviews. He made corrections of names on some of them. You know, he wanted to add to and elaborate on some things. So it was collaborative as long as it could be collaborative. But he didn't care what I did, and I feel fine about that. I feel more concerned, especially given the current state of U.S.-China relations. I'm not interested in getting his daughter or his grandchild in trouble. You know, there are complications like that. You never get to be free of the moment you're writing in. And so I'm wrestling with some of that too. Thanks for the question. It's, you know, that's the question that bugs me every day.
We'll take one more question. I think there's someone back there.
Gail, that was that was great.
Thanks, Jim.
And it will be useful to me in a whole variety of ways. My question, it dovetails a bit on Jim's, but I wonder, well, whether, first of all, do you feel you're about done with this? And is it going to be an article or a book? And then, well, then beyond that, where might you go with it? And one of the things that I'm particularly curious about is whether or not, assuming that what you found out about him isn't entirely unique, could there be other stories? Mm-hmm. Could you tell them together? If you wanted to try to do that, mm-hmm. What might you learn from other stories of people who are middle level, neither at the top of the hierarchy nor anywhere near the bottom? What might you learn from other stories that you just haven't been able to learn from this?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Well, I think it's a book, not an article. I think I'm currently thinking I'm just going to follow him around from place to place and organize it that way, the different worlds that he moved through. And of course, when he's in each world, he encounters other people who are having similar kinds of experiences, like the people in the Chinese Student Christian Association, half of whom were underground communists, as far as I can tell. I don't think I'm going to try to tell the individual stories of any of the rest of them, but I can show, as he encounters them, what kind of collectivities there were out there that have not loomed large in our story of this revolution, because it was very much centered in China. And every once in a while people say, oh yeah, Zhou Enlai studied in Paris in the 1920s, and then he came back and became a communist and marched around with Mao. But these people that were on the edge or in the middle all the way through, I want to try to say something about the connections they made and the dilemmas they faced. And in that way, I probably will draw on everything I can about people that he encountered who have names and biographies, and some of them have a little more written material than he did. He was against memoirs. He said, you do something with this, I'll be dead, it's not going to bother me, but I have no desire to write a memoir. And in that, he's not entirely typical. There are a lot of sort of sanitized, polished, airbrushed political memoirs circulating in China, and I'm going to have to try to figure out how to draw upon those and see how they can illuminate some of this. You all asked such great questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Gail.
Thank you. Thanks.
I don't know if you heard this from the audience, but that was a really awesome talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And so that's our talk for tonight. I believe there are refreshments out in the lobby. Thank you all for coming.